All right, we're live. Excuse me. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight for our Planning a Rifle Elk Hunt Masterclass with Cody Rich. We're going to give it just a minute or two to let folks get settled in. While we're waiting, a couple housekeeping items. Your audio and video are turned off, so you don't have to worry if you've got noise in the background or anything like that. We can't see you, we can't hear you. This class is being recorded, so if you do have to drop off early or anything like that, you can go back and watch it on our YouTube channel. We'll also send you an email tomorrow evening with the video link if you're unable to find it on our YouTube for one reason or another. If you do have any questions, drop them in the Q&A box down below. We'll answer as many of those as we have time for tonight. The chat is there as well. That's better for just kind of, chopping it up with other people or chatting a little bit, saying hi, where you're from. Questions do tend to get lost in there. So if you do have a question you'd like answered, the Q&A box is for that. Finally, we are doing a giveaway tonight. We got some pretty new onX Hunt Blaze Orange hats that we're going to be giving away towards the end of the class. So stick around. We'll post that giveaway link in the chat. And with that, I want to introduce our expert here, Cody Rich. What's going on?
Hey guys, yeah, welcome. I'm checking out all these things. Hey from LA. I'm like, wow, that's crazy. Ohio, so Sean from Oregon. So this is pretty cool. Yeah, stoked to be here. If you guys don't know who I am, my name's Cody Rich. I host the Rich Outdoors podcast, and I do like this thing called Wapiti Wednesday, and I fairly obsessed with elk hunting. So the other thing is I'm fairly obsessed with maps. So I spend a lot of time looking at maps, thinking about maps, e-scouting on maps, you name it. So if you guys haven't yet, we did an entire e-scouting series for onX's YouTube channel, and that's a 4-video series. And let me tell you, I struggled to get that down to like 2 hours or whatever it is. So I'm going to try to just pound through some of this stuff. It's going to be over some people's heads, and there's going to be a bunch of context missing. So if you feel like it's over your head, go back and check out the YouTube video. I promise it's broken down a lot more. That's a 4-step series. And in this one, I'm kind of going super heavy into just video 2 and video 3, which is essentially, like how to plan this out. Right. And then I'm going to show you a bunch of like little tips and stuff I do actually looking at maps, what I'm looking for and all of those things. So for anyone who's like, man, you lost me at like 2 minutes in, maybe go watch the YouTube video, but I think you'll get a lot of tips and tactics. That series was kind of built around archery hunting, but in general, it's virtually the same. And that's a huge piece of it. So I just want to kind of put that out there for everyone. And I guess we'll kick it off. I'm going to, let me share my screen here. Going. Alrighty, so to kick this off, let's get this first party here. Of course, I'm in my own way here. I'm gonna have to move myself around. All right, we're going to talk about rifle e-scouting and how I go about doing it, how tips, tactics, those little things. But here's the things we're going to go over. I'm going to teach you like the one thing I want everyone to take away from this meeting. And like, this is the most important thing when it comes to e-scouting. And I know a lot of people get confused and get overwhelmed with e-scouting. But this is like the one little thing I want everyone to kind of walk away from this webinar, we'll call it masterclass. And then we're going to go through like the 3 levels of search and how those are applicable to rifle elk hunting. And then we're going to talk a little bit about like the art of balance. In the 4-part video series, we talk a lot about building a target package, and I'm going to sum a lot of that up into as short as I can to get in this webinar, talking kind of like what I'm looking for, right? And constantly I get asked like, hey, what's the one thing, or what's the secret, or what's this or whatever. To me, it's a huge piece of just the balance of it, like balancing getting away from people with actual elk numbers and things like that. So we're going to dive into that, and then we're going to do some explore and discover, and I'm going to get into some actual maps and some actual units and show you guys kind of what I'm looking for, and kind of show you the key features, the key to target habitats, those type of things, what looks elky to me. Hope you guys get something out of that. And then if we have time, we'll do a little bit of building a plan and how that's applicable to like building these hunt plans, which I think is super, super important. Then we're going to get to Q&A if we have time. So enter your questions. And if your question doesn't get answered, I'll try to jump in after the fact and answer as many of these as I can, and hopefully get your questions answered as well. So let's just dive into it. Like I said, we're gonna buzz through this pretty quickly. Let me move myself here. All right. So the absolute number one thing that I want everyone to get out of this, the biggest mistake I see people making is that they're looking for some secret spot, some secret honey hole. And most people's hunting technique revolves around, spending a little bit of time looking at maps, looking at onX, and being like, "Oh, this looks like a good spot." And then they go there and they check it. It's this simple system of, check a spot, pick a spot, check a spot, pick a spot. What I want you guys to get out of an actual e-scouting system is to actually build a system, right? We want to build a way to search an entire unit to be as efficient and effective as we can. So many of you guys are going in and saying like, "Oh, let's check, no tell'em crick." And we hike in there and we hike out, right? Like, what I'm trying to do is not necessarily find the honey hole, so to speak, but I'm trying to build a system that allows me to scour an area to figure out where the elk are, right? In my elk hunting course and in the video series I did for onX, we talk a lot about, efficiency and effectiveness. And to me, it's, there's finding elk and then there's hunting elk. And when it comes to archery, finding elk is actually fairly easy. They tend to bugle and they're really active. And in rifle season, they're a little bit harder to find, but much easier to kill. So the two are definitely just kind of flip-flopped, if you will. But finding elk is the most important thing. Like, you have to be able to find elk. And in order to do that, the best way I know is to be very efficient and effective. Like, I want to have a system built. So when I show up to a unit, I'm checking here, I'm checking here, I'm checking here. This is what I'm doing. And I get route efficiency, right? I'm like, here's all the glassing points I'm going to hit, and I'm going to try to keep them on the same ridge, or, I'm going to cover this ground. And I can do that so much more effectively if I build a system. And this sounds cheesy, but I promise you, like, this is what great hunters do. Really effective hunters, they're not just picking random holes and, maybe good spots on a map and checking. They're building a system to where it's like, I can be efficient with my time. A lot of rifle seasons that I've hunted over the years, they're very short, and you got to be super efficient with that time because you only get a few days to do it. So that's the one thing I want you guys to take away, is this is about building a system for efficiency and not just about how to find a honey hole. Because even, I consider myself a pretty good e-scouter. Even I can't pick human pressure all the time. Sometimes I get there and I'm like, this is going to be a good spot. And you know what? There's people everywhere. So by having a system, it allows me to do that. So that's the huge thing. Some other important things is the separating finding elk from hunting elk. And a huge piece of this, and rifle hunting is this is very applicable, because so many guys, they want to go here and they hunt, and then they go here and they hunt, they're looking for elk, where, it's like, to me, it's like, you got to be able to just find elk. Like, my job is to show up to a unit and to be able to find elk. That's what I need to do. Then I can start hunting and figuring out, if the bull I want is in that area, or, how to actually get one killed. But at the end of the day, like, I need to be able to find elk. I need to show up to a unit and find it. And we're going to go over how I'm able to do that and how you can be able to do that too. And then it's going to be, building plans. I just covered it, but, building plans is important. That way I know what to do and when. Talked a little bit about it, but archery versus rifle, why are they different? How are they different? Archery, again, we're talking about elk that are rutting. They're very active. They're, usually less hunting pressure. If you're hunting like some of these generals, maybe not. But at the end of the day, rifle elk are very different. This is most of these units, unless you're hunting some, maybe Utahs, or these prime, Arizona tags where you get rutting activity. Most of us are hunting elk in areas where elk, recluse away from the rest of the herd, and they, go to these deep, dark holes. And so their terrain is far more centered around security than in those things. So we're going to dive into a little bit of that as well, and kind of what to look for. But security kind of becomes everything. How do you get away from people? How do you find these elk that kind of just hold up in small holes or these deep, dark canyons? So we're going to dive into a lot of that. All right. take a drink here. A lot of rambling. All right. So the three phases when I look at elk scouting, e-scouting, I kind of break it into three phases. I talk a lot about this in the video. I'm going to try to sum it up because we're not going to cover everything in this video. But I look at it as like, okay, when I start panning around, say I have a Montana general tag, I'm looking at, I still have to choose what unit. And so like when I think about these type of things, I'm looking at the type of hunt I want, maybe the population, and the pressure, right? So these numbers are found a lot in, we go to the, our top rut and we like look at the hunt numbers, the type of hunt we want. Do we want a still hunting timber hunt? Do we want a hunt where we can glass everything? Are we doing a horseback hunt? Are we doing a backpack hunt? All these things, those kind of come into the unit level. I'm not going to dive into a lot of that. I did in the full series we did. The most important here is kind of the areas and the drainage. So first we choose a unit. And once we have a unit, then we can kind of break down, what half of that unit we're going to choose. And then we can break it into the drainage level. So when it comes to like selecting an area, in this picture here, and we're going to dive into this unit a little bit, is it's not a great tag, but it's, it's a 27 Idaho tag. It's an early rifle hunt. I actually had this tag and I ended up drawing a better tag. So I traded it in. So I had done some e-scouting for this unit, but I'm not going to end up there. So I'm going to share some knowledge of what I learned. When I think about this, is like, okay, I'm given 27. I mean, I can hunt a couple different units within that tag, the North Fork tag. But, when I think about areas, one of the big things is, again, hunting style. How does each area of a unit, help or hurt my style of hunting? To me, it's like, I really want to be able to glass. I want to be able to cover ground, and look as far as I can. Cause that's what's going to be able to cover the most amount of ground for me. And so like hunting style comes into it, mobility, assets, and limitations. Like, if you don't have horses, if you can't hike more than a couple miles, like, what side of the unit you choose has a lot to do with those things. Access, historically the Frank Church doesn't have a ton of access. So, that's going to limit those things. But even within that, terrain types, if you're like, I want to still hunt timber, I want to just track elk down, then, picking the thicker size of the unit may be the case. If you want to be able to glass and cover ground, some of the more open country, right? And, things like, the habitat, burns, water, those things kind of come into play. But at the end of the day, again, if you're depending if you're talking late season, early season, security is going to be a big piece of it. When we talk about late season security, these bulls are moving away. They're trying to just, hold up, get ready for winter. They're trying to recover from the rut. We talk about early season, you're talking about elk that's going to be doing more rutting. They're probably going to be higher. They're going to be at those elevations. If they get pressure, they're probably going to be in the bottom poles. So like, that's how we start choosing drainage levels. So when I think about this, it's like, I first choose the unit level. Here's the things that come into mind for me when I think about area, what side of the unit. A big reason, we'll get into this in a little bit. A big reason I chose this part of the unit is because, you look at historically 27, not the best unit. There's good elk in there, but it's not known for giant bulls. And then right on this border right here, you have unit 36, the sawtooth, and that's one of the better tags in Idaho. So naturally, I instantly knew that I wanted to be on that border between 36 and 27, and for a number of reasons, but none the least is that clearly the sawtooth is a better tag than some of the remote country in, say, the north or in the Frank Church. So those help you choose that what side of the unit you be on. Then we get into like huntability, right? And huntability is huge, huge, huge. Route efficiency. So a lot of this is like, I know I kind of want to be in this area, but then I start picking it apart. I start adding my waypoints. I start, finding my glassing, finding my routes, and all of a sudden particular drainages will stand out and others won't because of pure route efficiency, right? Like, I need to be able to cover a bunch of ground. I could have the best honey hole in the world, but if that honey hole requires me to go 12 miles in and there's nothing to hunt between those 12 miles, I'll probably just leave it. I'm not going to go there because I would rather take an area where I can hunt multiple drainages from one ridge. I can glass a ton of country, those type of places. And, we'll kind of get into a little bit of that, but that's kind of like the three phases I use. And I'll go through how it looks like, or what it looks like on paper or on map, but it's like, I'll start to just kind of map things out on a very big picture. And then I start to hone in like, okay, this is the area. And I start, bit by bit, kind of areas of interest, adding those. And I'll get into how I do that. And then eventually it gets into pure just huntability. Can I actually hunt that effectively and efficiently? And then route efficiency. Can I access that country? Can I get around in that country? Those type of things. So those are kind of the three phases that we go through. Kind of went over a lot of this. All right. So within phase one, I'm bouncing around here, but within phase one, the type of hunt, some of this comes into like the points cost, choosing your unit. If you have a general unit, those can be difficult or to hunt, but at the same time, you talk about, a limited entry trial hunt. A lot of times you have easier access and things like that. So, big pieces of it. When we think about building that target package, we're like, okay, what are the animals looking for? Three things elk are always looking for is security, water, and food. That's kind of the MO. In the rut, you could kind of change a little bit of that, but when it comes to rifle hunting, man, security is the most important. Generally speaking, most of the places I've ever hunted, water wasn't a huge issue. Now, in some of the southern states, maybe, and food, food kind of can be there, but at the same time, most of what we're hunting is not going to have that issue. Now, if you take, I don't know, some desert country, I have an Arizona late tag, in some of that country, I can tell like food definitely matters. There probably won't be elk in certain areas, whereas some other areas, food becomes a priority as we look at that, but not always the case. So this kind of gets into what I call the art of balance. The art of balance, tons of people ask me questions, is it better to go with this? Is it better to be remote? Is it better to be mobile? This is a classic question. And I've done a ton of horseback hunting, and I've spent time, very far in there. And I've also, road hunted, and it's always a balance. And I think it's important to think about all these things: population, access, hunting pressure, even down to like choosing a unit and point cost, as there's always a balance, and it's kind of a pendulum. So when we talk about, let's say horsebacking in somewhere, the upside is that there's less people sometimes, and unpressured elk, these elk don't seem to be, holed up in the timber or whatever. But at the same time, I've horsebacked into places and, been 12 miles in and there's not a single elk, and you're not mobile, right? Like, so the mobility becomes a factor. Whereas, sometimes if you're using the road systems, you can cover so much more ground, you can actually find elk, right? Like I can cover 100 miles in a truck pretty quickly and be on the other side of a unit and maybe in the next unit. And so it's kind of it's a balance, right? And rifle hunting becomes very important because we've all been there. You show up to any trailhead and it's loaded full of trucks or whatever, right? And there's people everywhere. You can hard to get away from people. It does seem like there's a balance in those pockets of finding that, 3 miles in or 2 miles in where people aren't getting to. And so I always like to balance my mobility. I like to be mobile, but I also will hike into certain places. And once we get into the maps, and I can show you a little bit more, but to me, it's super important to kind of stay away from a lot of those heavily pressured areas. I mean, there's tons of road hunters. Anything you can see from a road, in at least in the units I rifle hunted, generally, people are hunting. They're watching it. They're driving around. They're looking for elk, right? But what they don't do is, a lot of people, if they can't see into an area, they don't just go hiking in there, right? And there's a kind of a paradox here where, generally speaking, the more roads in a unit, the less people get off the roads. If they can drive around, they will. And so here's that balance, that art of balance, right? Like I don't mind units with a lot of roads because it creates road hunters, and that gives me the ability to find these pockets. And so access is it's one of those pendulums, right? Unit 27 in Idaho is one of those where it's like there's not a ton of access. You're probably going to see horse hunters, And by that, you're going to probably get to these super remote locations. And that's where people are going to want to go. Because it doesn't have the access, it actually draws in a lot of, horseback hunters, backpack hunters, flying hunters. There's a lot of remote hunters. And so it, by definition, like those interior pieces of the Frank Church tend to get as much pressure as, some of the road systems. And so here's that art of balance. Like, how do we balance, finding, getting away from people, finding that security? Because security is not always just being remote. It's not always just like being the deepest, darkest hole. Sometimes security is right next to the road, and it blows people's minds, but plenty of giant bulls have lived untouched right next to pretty busy highways. And, that's that paradox. So, those are the things we're always trying to find. Same with pressure, right? Like, I just don't go to trailheads. Like it's off the block. And I try to find those, those pressure zones where I'm finding those pockets. Very similarly, point cost, it's a balance, right? Like, great. If I could have 10 point units every year, that would be great. But by definition, that makes it hard to hunt very often. So, we're balancing like, okay, how many points do we want to use? But this ability to hunt units consistently, to learn units and those things. So to me, that's the art of balance. There's never any one thing per se. All right. And some of this is from that video I did with those. So, I did want to touch on, so kind of in this phase one, as we build our target package, we're trying to choose an area, try to do all these things, historical data is huge. Man, I can't tell you, like, if a unit's just historically produced good bulls and has good populations, generally speaking, that's good indication that, this area is going to produce. And that somehow gets so overlooked, and a lot of people just don't think about that. Again, we're going to dive into my keys to success. I would say security, absolutely. I'm always looking for security, and I don't always, I'm trying to balance that with mobility, but security is kind of number one. Again, balancing that population and access. I want good numbers, and this is going to depend on what you want out of an elk hunt. But I'm trying to balance these like good population numbers, which means I'm going to have opportunities with access. And I don't necessarily need, all the access in the world and lots of roads, but maybe some limited access, just the ability to get away from people, because that's going to go back to my number one, creating security. And, how can I have to have a way to avoid pressure. And sometimes that boils down to like, how am I like, what are my benefits? Am I taking horses? Do I have a dirt bike? Am I rafting into some country? What are your assets that you can get, like, you can create a way to get away from that pressure. And that's kind of boils into like, what's my secret weapon? How am I going to win in this area? And that's kind of, in choosing a unit, or, in some ways, like an area, so to speak. All right. So I need to burn through this a lot faster. All right. So phase two, choosing the area. We talked a lot about hunting style. We talked about mobility limitations, mobility assets, all these like, hey, what do I have to get away from people? One of these target parameters, this is where we start like, okay, what are we looking for? What are the elk looking for? Does it have all the things, things like edge habitat, can they move in and out of, feed and timber, and burns, things like that, and elevation. So can we use elevation to our advantage? Those type of things. One of my key features, and I'll try to go over this in the map, the thing that I have found so much success in rifle hunting is my ability to find this timber that's a certain density. And I've just figured it out in the maps, and I'll try to find some for you guys on a map. But the ability, these bulls will go into these thinner timbers where it's thin enough that this feed's actually growing, and they can just basically be up eating all day. That has been my go-to. And, a lot of people, they go out and they're looking in parks, meadows, big open and clear cuts. And a lot of times, like, if elk are getting pressured, they're not living in those, and maybe they're not even using them in the daylight. Where we have found success is our ability to hone in on timber that's huntable. And we kind of talked a little bit about that, but it's like, I need to be able to shoot into this timber, because getting in that timber with those elk it doesn't work out as well. So I'm trying to find that timber with a, adjacent face that's 400 or 500 yards away. And so I start looking for these things, and my ability to glass into the timber and find those elk. That's what I'm going to start looking at that area. And that's maybe burns are great, and a lot of people will hunt those burns, but I'm actually looking for that timber density, and that's that my secret advantage that I'm going to look for. Going back to historical data, neighboring units, like I had talked about this one. Unit 36 is a great unit. Obviously, I'm going to be on the south end of 27 because I think, a lot, maybe there's some crossover. I actually don't know for sure. I've never been there. But this is kind of a reference. You can apply that to a lot of places. This is where talking to a biologist is also really good. Like getting historical data, people tend to try to use biologists for drainage level answers, and you're going to get this answer that biologists kind of give everyone. Whereas area level type questions often get you a lot further. So, if I go to a biologist and say, hey, what drainage should I go to? Well, you just gave him a blanket question. He's going to give you a blanket answer, which is like, yeah, go to No Tell'em Creek. I've just told the last 6 people that. So even if you go in and you have some knowledge, you say, hey, is Rock Creek any good? And he's like, yeah, there's elk in Rock Creek. A better question or a better way to approach this is to go to your biologist and say like, hey, I'm really kind of leaning towards this southeast region of this unit. What can you tell me about the winter recoveries and things like that? What can you tell me about the populations? He or she should have a pretty good answer for that. And that's going to get you a lot farther than asking specific drainages. If you know that the southeast corner of a particular unit is a good place to start because that had a better winter recruitment, from there, it's pretty easy to figure out the drainages, right? Like he'll answer that question, and then it's not hard to like deduct the rest of it. And so that's a great resource as far as like deciding on an area. This goes into the same as like previous tag holders. Huntingful is a great resource for this. And if you have a draw tag, like this is absolutely, first on your list to do is talk to these guys. And sometimes tag holders will give you specific drainages, especially if it's, a very coveted tag or one that they're not going to draw again. But often, you can just ask them like, hey, how was the pressure on the north end of the unit? And they'll be like, man, we ran into people everywhere up there. We ended up going on the south side and we didn't have any pressure. Again, that information is actually far more valuable than specific drainage information. Once I have an area, I've kind of reduced it into like my focus. And from there, I can create hunt plans, strategies, how to cover that unit. I can dial in the specifics about a drainage if I just know like rough areas. That's more important. And you usually get better answers that way. So just a little tidbit on phase 2. I'm going to skip some of this just for sake of time. Kind of understanding your target. Like when we talk about elk, again, security, absolutely important. If I'm not a huge fan of north slopes. But having said that, depending on the time frame, you talk about south slopes versus north slopes. Are we talking about wintering bulls? Is this a late season? Those things, like understanding those basic knowledge type stuff. In my experience, elk are where they elk are, and you can sit here and say like, oh, they should be here, but they rarely are. So as we dive into like the art of say understanding these elk that we're looking for, proximity to things, like that's super important to me. Do they have all the things they need? Do they have that security? Do they have the ability to get back in the timber? Do they have the ability to stay in the timber? Is that timber huntable? Those type of things. Like too many people just look at like, I'm going to go hunt parks, or I'm just going to hunt these openings or clear cuts. That's what everyone else is doing. So we need to find a way to do something different. Huntability could mean, just because I can see elk, it's impossible to shoot them from anywhere, and that can be difficult. And so thinking about the huntability, the animal behavior, all these things tie into it as you're understanding your target species. I'm going to skip the slide for sake of time. If you guys have questions, please let me know. All right. So phase 2 summary. Again, what's your personal style? What's your personal hunting parameters? What is, your style of hunting? What kind of hunt do you want out of the deal? And then, what kind of habitat is going to facilitate that type of hunt? That's pretty key. What can you be looking for to make this hunt happen? And then historical data, super big on that. Like that's going to boil down the area. I think historical data is really, really important on the area level. People tend to look at it on a unit level, but they rarely look at it as area level. All right, my keys to success. Does my access match my hunting style? Can I, get there? Timber density. That's a huge one for me. That's like my key focus that I'm looking for. Does it have the right keys to that? Historical proof. Like, do I have some version of historical proof to say like this area of the unit holds elk? Why or why not? And then the only thing I would add to that is again huntability. Can I efficiently hunt this area? But that kind of gets. I'll have to do some digging on the phase 3 side of that before make those decisions. Sorry, Jack. We're burning through this here. How am I doing so far? Good? Bad? Anybody got any questions?
I think it's going great.
All right. Are we learning anything? Okay, so phase 3. Now we're like getting into this drainage level, right? We're like, okay, which drainage am I going to hunt? And this will make more sense when we dive into actually looking at maps. But again, huntability, route efficiency, proximity to everything is really, really important. Target parameters, this is where we start getting into like, the actual timber density, the edge habitat, maybe water feed, those type of things, slope direction. This is where those pieces of that puzzle start to become more important. When we talk about historical data, I'm always like every phase of this, I think about how do I apply some historical data? Some of this may be previous sightings. This scouting season, like all of that matters, right? Like how much time you spend in the unit. If I've seen sign in there, is the sign match, the time stamp of what I'm looking for? If I see a bunch of rubs and whatnot, maybe that's not the area I want to be hunting late rifle versus, these type of things. So does the sign match? Am I getting a lot of wintering? Travel routes. This is where, doing some research into figuring out where these elk are wintering and, am I kind of in that path? It doesn't take a whole lot of research to figure out, okay, the elk winter here and they summer here. Let me do some backtracking and figure out at what point in the map are we here. So a lot of people miss this, right? Like, it's pretty easy to find all the wintering data. If I just say, okay, where are these elk summering? And maybe this is a good question for the biologist. These elk rut here and they winter here. Somewhere in that path is probably, my October dates. Somewhere in that path is my early November dates, my mid-November dates. Where are these elk holding up? And, how am I going to figure that out? And so, looking at, let's just say this, the Frank Church. If I can figure out where those elk, which isn't on the map here, but, down to the right, if I know they kind of spend most of their summers in their rut pretty high, and then they're going to end up, rut down towards the river. A lot of these elk are, spending their winters on the river. How can I, find those pockets that are halfway between? Pretty simple stuff like that. And also a lot of that's just, you can confirm that with the biologist. All right. And again, we're going to dive into the phase 3. This will make a little bit of sense, trying to figure out your route efficiency and your huntability and those things. It's a little bit easier to just do that on the map and then, getting eyes on. And even within this phase 3, I may choose, let's say, go back into phase 2. I may choose an area of the unit. I get to spend some time scouting it. And I realize, yeah, there's no route efficiency. Like this is not easy to get to, or there's no elk. I don't see any sign. I don't see any actual elk, all these things. And so historical data can be within your own. You can say like, okay, yeah, I'm just not seeing the animals, right? Eyes on is a huge, huge piece of it. All right. My keys to success, effectiveness, or effectively and efficiently searching it, right? Like, can I cover this ground? And again, this goes back to the one thing I wanted to make very abundantly clear. I'm not looking for honey holes. I'm looking for routes and systems, right? And I know that's not sexy. I think everyone wants to be able to look at a map and just figure out where the honey hole is, where that 400-inch bull lives. But the reality is like you look at the system that guys who consistently kill giants, some of these great outfitters, they're great outfitters. They basically do the basics really well. They cover that ground. They cover every square inch of a unit, and they got a ton of people doing it. So if you can kind of map that same thing, like how do we just cover this unit and find out where, the good populations are, or the good bulls are, that's how we're going to be effective. And then it's consistently gathering in the field data and kind of revamping that as we go. So the more scouting we have, the better. All right. And after I originally did this, I was thinking about, I was actually on a spring bear hunt last year, and I was like, this place we're going doesn't make any sense, but we're going there. And we ended up killing a good bear. And it got me thinking about this honey hole card. And as much as I say, like, don't focus on the honey hole, I think we all have like a spot on the map we see. It doesn't make a lot of sense logically. Oh, I guess we're here. Sorry. That was my last slide, I think. But uh, anyway, so it doesn't make a ton of sense logically, but it's the place you have to get to. And as hunters, we all have this. We all have that spot that we're just like, I want so bad to there. I know that this spot holds giant, right? And so I give myself a honey hole card. And it's like the one spot I gotta, satiate the explorer in myself to go, I'm going there. It doesn't make a ton of sense, but maybe there's something there. And so I keep places as I'm sea scouting. If I find a place that doesn't make a ton of sense, doesn't map to my entire system, that's like, I put that on the honey hole card. So if you guys ever have a spot, I don't want to say you can't go there, it doesn't make sense, because a lot of it is like my gut intuition, man, I just got to check this place out. So I do give myself at least one or two of those on any hunt. But the reality is I'm trying to focus on like, how do I do this efficiently? How do I do this effectively? How do I cover this unit? So that's kind of the honey hole card, if you will. So I'm going to dive into some actual mapping here. What you guys really came for. Well, I don't know about that. Okay. So this, like I said, this is unit 27. Kind of zoom out for those who don't really know. This is right smack dab in the middle of kind of Idaho. Oops. Ooh, okay. And for ease of use, I'm going to turn this. This is the wilderness, but let's turn off the wilderness layer so we can see better. So when it comes to, this is kind of my, it's going to be a super big overview. When it comes to explore and discover, for me, I start any unit with like, I just kind of start perusing around and I'm laying down what I call areas of interest. And I'm just, big picture, like, oh, this kind of looks interesting. Sometimes that starts with like these little ones, I'm like, oh, this drainage looks good, or this. And sometimes it's like, I know I want to be in this area, blah, blah, blah. If you guys go watch the entire YouTube video series I did, I talk a lot about how to use folders. And I'm a huge believer in having folders because I can hide things and move things off the map, all of these things. So a lot of it is, it's just cruising around. And what I'm looking for, I'm actually let's just delete this one for a second. So what I'm cruising around, and man, most of my stuff I find just spending a lot of time looking, and I'm looking for that balance, right? We call it the art of balance, but I'm looking for the balance of, elky, bucky, those type of things. And a lot of my time is just like, oh, this looks interesting, right? So I spend a ton of time doing this. And, I may end up on the other side of the whole mountain. I may end up 2 units away and I'm still circling stuff. And it's just like, ooh, this is interesting. Ooh, this is interesting. And I know that's not a lot of rhyme or reason to it, but I do just spend a lot of time kind of looking for edge habitat, looking for the balance, right? And I'll come back and I'll clean this up later. So my point of this is like, I spend a lot of time kind of flying around, looking at country. I'm looking for LP Bucky, which to me is, it's a balance of edge habitat, cover, like all these things. And I'll start just circling. And this is what I call the rough draft phase, where I'm kind of just, this looks good. This looks good. And once we have kind of a rough draft, so to speak, and it's got to be short, this is why it takes me hours and hours and hours to do this. But, say hypothetically, I have these two, maybe I have some over here, I have this over here. Then I can start to piece together like, okay, what does this look like? How do I actually hunt this? And am I seeing a cluster of things that are really good? And in this case, I'm giving away all the secrets here. I actually really do think there's definitely elk here. And so, I'm kind of looking for a bunch of things. So let's just say I spent hours and hours and I circle a bunch of dots. They're kind of all over the unit. Usually it's probably 10 times as many as this. But now I'm like, okay, how do I put together a pattern, right? What am I looking at? And so a lot of it is I circle these areas of interest, and then I'll come through and I'll start kind of just looking for glassing points, right? And this country, gosh, you can see everything from everywhere. Um, and sometimes it's better, if you can just hit glassing points. This country, like, again, this country is so easy. Another way to do it is, I'll just go to topo mode. And a lot of times in topo mode, you know, to me, the lines make sense because it's like, oh, if I, let's just hypothetically anywhere on this ridge, like, okay, this allows me to see this and this, right? That's a super basic, right? I'm trying to think of a better version. Say you're mobile, you're like, oh, this road up here allows me to see down all these drainages. I'm trying to find a good example in it. Generally speaking, if you have, this is kind of a good example, but not, it's kind of an example, but not a great one. Anywhere you have like these split canyons where you have a bunch of fingers, if I can find one spot that it allows me to look up 3 different drainages, all of a sudden that becomes a lot more efficient, right? And, this broken country where we have a bunch of different pockets and stuff, that can be difficult to see on the same side. Whereas, oh, this little finger comes out here and I can see all of this. So a lot of times I'm looking for things like that, to where it's like, okay, how can I see all of this? So, I get down this ridge and maybe I'll come out here. And even if like I can come back later and figure out if these are, good spots to actually glass. Of course, my Skype thing's always in the way here. But this gives me the ability, like, again, I'm kind of just rough draft. I'll come back and clean this up. And I don't think that's in the right unit, but it kind of gives you the idea how I'm going about it. So as I'm like kind of cruising this, I may bounce back and forth between, say, satellite and topo to figure out, topo gives you a really easy way to kind of choose glassing points, knobs, things like that, because it gives you a much cleaner version of what you're looking at. Whereas, being able to fly around and say like, man, yeah, see, this kind of looks a little too thin to me and it's south facing. So realistically, not ideal. I mean, this is super steep country, by the way. But like, I don't mind this. So this is a good example of this edge habitat. Like, I really don't mind this. It's pretty high. But early season, if you had that rifle tag that opens early September, this drainage might hold elk, and there's a few things we don't know, food, water, those things. Obviously there's food, it's broken habitat, there's enough open, right? And so we're kind of just cruising this country, and like, oh, this is really thick stuff, right? Maybe there's, archery type hunting, that type of thing. This face here type thing, like, so I spend a lot of time looking for these like broken habitat. And, again, maybe let's just say like, I want to circle this here. It's not a commitment yet. It's just kind of just, bam, we're doing this areas of interest. This is why I use the file system and I put all these in a file so I can kind of hide them later. But then we're going to go back and clean this up. And again, we're looking for patterns, right? We're looking for a bunch of areas of interest that we can stack together on one ridge. And I know I'm kind of getting low on time here. So I'm going to show you this. I really like this area. There's a couple things I like and don't like. Looks like there's some springs down here. But a lot of this is, I'm just going to delete this so I can see better. A lot of this is, very, very broken terrain. This is super steep, nasty country, but this is where big bulls like to hide. Here we have, looks like some burn, we got some thicker stuff. It's not just the middle of a burn. There's a bunch of features we like in here that are just elky, right? And as I was panning, like, man, there's another drainage here. So you got one drainage, we got two drainage, kind of even three. Like, this one's a little more burned out, but man, that still looks good to me. Like, that still looks super elky. And there's a lot of pockets, right? Just micro pockets. This one's got a trail in it. So, as we look at this, at least as I looked at it, and we go to topo, this will, man, get out of my way. As we look at the topo, this might not be evident to everyone, but turn around, make you guys real sick. There's kind of a ridge here. So we got a pocket here, we got a pocket here, we got a pocket here, we kind of have a pocket over here, we got a pocket over here. And so to me, what jumps out in my mind is like, man, if I can just be on this ridge, like this is great. I'm in my way. I don't want that one. Line tool. So this ridge is, 5 miles long, and there's tons of, stuff to glass off that. And, all these little micro pockets. So to me, that's like kind of jumping out. And so what I next did was I was like, okay, well, how do I get there? Right. So it looks like we could come off this road, and here, if you guys are interested, I just used the new route builder tool and built this. But with that, it's like, okay, how far is it now? That's 8 miles. It's a pretty good poke. If you're on foot and trying to pack elk out on foot by yourself, that might be too far. But if we got horses, that's doable. And so like, here, this actually has a motorcycle trail in it. So if you had a motorcycle, now you're getting up here, pretty steep country, pretty tough to do. This is definitely not for everyone, but getting up here into this area is kind of doable. And we're crossing this unit. And so like, as I think about those, I'm just trying to figure out what is the best route in here. And then, what is the route of efficiency that's going to line up, a bunch of different spots. I did want to show you guys if I can find it. I'm going to try to leave time for some questions too. I feel like I'm running out of time. So when I talk about being able to glass across, let's see if I can find it. And this is like the thing that I look for in a rifle area. Phone's going off here. This stuff looks pretty thick. This isn't the best example, but it's just almost too steep too. Gosh, I could go over how to use tools to figure out steepness. onX needs it, Jack. We need a feature that like has timber density. So here's an okay example, but not a great. So see how this timber is, you have some thick timber and some thin timber, right? This isn't the perfect example, but this actually might work. So if elk were here, there you could almost see them inside this timber. So let's just hypothetically zoom out for a second and say like I could be on this ridge here. Let's just, so 330 yards. Here we go. Found it. So hypothetically, we could probably be up maybe a little higher to be able to see down in, but now we're up on this ridge and we can look at this timber face, right? And this timber face, these elk will probably, hypothetically, I don't know this area, they'll be in timber like this where they can be up feeding and there's just enough light coming in, that they have vegetation. In Idaho specifically, I really like that woody vegetation. It's that woody underbrush. If you know elk very well, you know that a lot of them will switch to woody browse about mid-October. And so they'll feed on this brush. They'll feed in the grass too, but a lot of times they're eating on this, Idaho brush that's under the trees. And so I tend to hone in on things like this. I may circle this as an area of interest. Again, I don't think that's the perfect example, but I wanted to give you guys an example of what I'm looking for. That's like my key advantage. Let's see here. Even this stuff doesn't look terrible. It's we're super high here. So that might be a problem in an October hunt, but things like that. Trying to see. But yeah, you guys kind of get the point. All righty. That's kind of my spiel, so to speak. Gosh, I feel like it was super rushed and I didn't get time to explain anything. If you guys, if you missed something or you got questions, I'll try to answer as many questions as I can. Also, I do feel like I'd go into depth a lot more in the 2-hour 4-part series on the YouTube channel. But Jack, did I just ramble on, or do we cover some good stuff?
No, I thought that was good. There's a ton of information packed in there. I'm definitely going to be rewatching this at some point. I kind of wish I had a pad to take notes or something. Um, so I will definitely say I've watched the 4-part series on our YouTube channel. Like you said, that's super good, super in depth. So everybody, if you haven't checked that out, go to the onX YouTube channel. You can find the playlist there and roll through those. I think it is, like you said, about an hour 45, almost 2 hours worth of education there. So
Right.
definitely plug that. We did have some good questions in here. Before
Yeah.
we get into the questions, I'm just going to post the giveaway link for everybody in the chat. So we're giving away some new onX Blaze Orange hats we just came out with. So that giveaway link is there. It'll be live until midnight tonight, and then I'll shoot the winners an email tomorrow, and we'll get your hats sent out, and they'll be to you hopefully before your rifle hunt kicks off. Had a few questions on differences between hunting bulls and maybe if I have a cow elk tag. What would you look for differently if you just had a cow tag?
That's a really great question. First and foremost, I would focus on mobility. Like if I'm looking for a 400-inch bull, I have to cover, a certain amount of ground. To find a cow, I would focus on mobility. I would focus on closer to wintering ground. So I had kind of mentioned that, generally speaking, we look at the wintering ground and then we work backwards based on the time frame from wintering. And that's a great way to do it. So if you want to kill a cow, just say in Montana. Montana is pretty public about, where the wintering areas are. Those cows are just going to be much closer to the wintering areas than the bulls. So the bigger the bull, this is super rough, right? Like, don't quote me on this, but generally speaking, the bigger the bull, the farther away from the rut or farther away from the wintering area he's going to be in those deeper, darker pockets. The older bulls, again, that's a rough, rule of thumb, but a lot of times the cows are going to be much closer. So I would just look at the wintering areas and then, kind of work back a little bit and then focus again on like, how do I cover a ton of ground? Because, if I just choose a timber patch and walk into it, I may have to choose 200 timber patches and walk into them before I find a cow. I mean, Jack did it, but who knows? But if I say like, okay, I want to start super big, I want to just like glass this whole area of the unit, I'm going to start really big. And then I see cows, I can move in on them. Too many people, they just kind of hone in on like, I'm going to hike into here and I'm going to hike into here. So to me, it's like, man, I still treat it as like, I want to cover as much ground as I can with big glass and like figure out where the elk are. And then I can hone in on that.
And that kind of leads into the second question. There's some few people asking about, if you look at the elk migration data that, state game agencies put out, it sounds like you do factor that into account when they're moving, especially later in the season, right?
Totally. And I should clarify that like, this is going to vary pretty wildly. Elk in Idaho, elk in Idaho tend to not migrate nearly as far as say elk in Wyoming. Wyoming has pretty long migrations, and so that can be a little bit difficult. The Montana is a little bit, it's kind of a migratory state. They migrate pretty far. Just depends on the area, but yes, like just look at the data and say like, okay, here's where they're moving from. And a lot of this collar data is not that hard to find, especially in the Yellowstone ecosystem. And that includes, all 3 states, not just within Yellowstone, but you can look at that data and be like, okay, here's where they're going. And it's not hard to figure out, where they came from.
Right. Any difference? A question about hunting more of that canyon country. I'm thinking my mind immediately goes to like Missouri Breaks or something like that. Do you scout it? Is your process similar to a mountain hunt, or is there any difference there?
As far as scouting or
Yes.
hunting. So when I think of canyon country, I think of this. I think of, I spent a lot of time in Northeast Oregon. That's very much canyon country. A lot of those elk don't even show up. So there are resident elk, say, to a lot of some of the canyon country, but sometimes those elk just don't show up until the snow hits, right? Or it's just a timing thing. And so sometimes scouting it is not as particularly advantageous. I will say most of the rifle hunts that I've ever done, I I would rather have 5 days of scouting, like up to the edge of season, and less time hunting than actually, spend time in the unit or during the season. But a lot of that can depend on how long the hunt is. When I've killed bulls in Oregon, and those are 5 day hunts, I like to have 5 days of scouting and 1 day of hunting. Like that's kind of how I love it, because it's like now I know exactly where I need to be. Typically, when you get into a season, day one of season, everything changes, right? The pressure hits, it's chaos, and like it's really tough. So ideally, I say that ideally, you have 5 days up to opening day, and you hunt opening day. And having said that, I have 2 rifle tags this year, and they're very long tags. And, I don't even know that I'll hunt opening day of either of them. To me, it's like, I think that it's going to, there's going to be a big pressure right on opening day. And then, you have bulls moving around on those longer seasons, especially when you think about just the time frame of, typically hunting pressure moves elk, but also winter moves elk, so you have elk moving around throughout a season. So I guess it depends on the length of the hunt. You look at like you said Montana breaks. That's a rifle season that's super long, that just naturally with no pressure, the difference between opening day and the last day is so different, right? And bulls are going to be moving around, and so it's kind of just time on target, which is like, you have to be in the unit, you have to be there. It can be dependent on, you look at like, say, this wintering data, right? Like, man, migration to units of any kind are pretty tough. Sometimes you get too much snow and it ruins it, right? So you just have to have, it goes back to like building my systems, right? I'm going to have systems or plans, hunt plans, that incorporate like, hey, opening day, mid-season, if I get snow, where am I going? Like all these things. And those are all different plans, right? Like if this happens, this, right? One, like, I didn't even talk about this, but one of the best things, if I have a hunt, especially a rifle hunt, and it's going to get a snowpack, man, that is like pure gold. I have to be there for no other reason, not the migration, not what people think, is tracks. Man, if you can look at tracks, like you can learn so much, right? Like I can just cover ground, drive every road, and I can look at the mountain and say, man, look, there's elk up there. I don't even have to see them. I can just see the tracks. And to me, if I have a rifle tag and I see a snowstorm coming, 1,000% positive I'm going to be in the unit to see what, like that snowstorm hits the next 24 hours. I need to be covering ground, figuring it out. And, maybe I'm looking at new areas, all these things. And so that's, I don't know, there's a lot of answers to that, but yes.
Yeah, that's seems to be the kind of golden ticket sometimes, especially those late rifle hunts. If you haven't had any snow and you're getting a storm coming in, just it's almost like it unveils some of the secrets of what the elk are doing for you. It's all
Oh,
it's
it
all
totally
laid out
does.
for you.
It totally does.
There was a question here, and this is kind of the $1 million question, or one that we get on a lot of our webinars, is if you go into a spot and you're maybe not seeing elk or sign right away, are you kind of bouncing and going to a new area, or do you tend to stick it out for a day or two and see if something shows up?
No, this is the $1 million question in hunting, is like, especially for people who don't have the experience, trusting your gut intuition only works if you have a bunch of gut intuition. And this is very true even for me, say on a new unit. I go to a new unit, I don't have the gut intuition built up. So a lot of times, previous experience, that historical data is going to tell us everything. You tend to find elk where you've seen elk before. And a lot of that is because they're there. You're going to look at it longer. So while I do feel like people bail on areas too quickly, like the assumption is they aren't there. Where how many times have you been to an area that you've seen elk in before and you're just not seeing them? You're going to hit that so much harder. And in my head, I hold on to that because I'm like, are they here? And I just don't see them. I know so many areas that there's elk and I'm just not seeing them. And maybe it takes a day or two and then I turn them up. So it's the classic, no one to hold them, no one to fold them. With that said, I'm not going to burn up a hunt, like just looking at an area. So it depends on how many days I have. It depends on my hunt plans. It depends on my hunting strategy, how far I'm in, right? Like if I commit to an area and it's going to take a full day to get there, I'm probably going to give it at least 3 days. And that seems like a lot, when you're burning days, but like I already have to, it's going to burn a day to get out of here. Like I have to be mindful of that. So to me, I tend to treat every area like I know there's elk there and I just got to turn them up. There's a couple, variations in that. One would be like, if I get snow, I'm moving as fast as I can because I should, I, even if there's elk there, there's tracks, right? If there's no tracks, then when there's no elk. And so, I will burn out of an area if I have snow. And again, it's like, I'm just covering as much as I can, as quick as I can. And that changes things. So, but to answer the question, you got to trust your gut. But you also got to build that historical data, have that gut intuition on an area. And so I tend to lean towards looking in an area a little bit longer than I want to, or than I would want to bail on. This is proved very, very significant in like these timber pockets that I love is, and again, this is my gut intuition. I've built this, record of history off of, looking at these timber patches. I think most people would walk away from them. And I just know, and I see it. I see that timber patch and I can look in there and I'm like, man, this has all the makings. It has all the pieces that I'm looking for. I will look at that timber patch much longer than most people. And it's proven successful. Now, have I stared at timber patches and seen nothing but squirrels? Absolutely. But I do think that far more times it's been, 6, 10, 12 hours into it. And all of a sudden it's like, there you are. And, you build that gut intuition over time. When you're new and you're like, I don't know what I don't know, it can be very difficult to stare at a timber patch and not see anything. But I do think that's a problem for most new hunters is they're running around expecting to see something in the wide open. And they just don't have that historical like gut intuition to stick and look at, a hillside for that long.
Yeah, I mean, that rings home for me. I
Right.
moved to Montana in 2018 when I started working at onX. So my first big game season was 19. So I guess I'm season 5 now. And like you said, just that I've said it so many times, I don't know what I don't know. And I'm kind of starting to get to that point now where it's like, oh, I know a few things. And my advice for new hunters, new people that started onX and move out here and stuff is like, and you just got to be okay with sucking for a little while. Like it's it's time in the woods and it's time spent out there, and you're probably going to go to some spots where there's nothing sometimes, and that can be valuable too, is just saying, oh, this spot didn't have anything, at least I
Yeah.
can mark it off the list and then kind of look at it and say, well, why wasn't there anything in there? Is it hunting pressure? Is it I just misread the habitat when I was e-scouting or whatever? Which if you're, a person coming from the east for your first elk hunt for a week is not the easiest pill to stomach sometimes. Obviously, I'm lucky in Montana. We've got long archery and rifle seasons to be able to put the time in. But
No, that brings up a good point, man. One of the ways that I figured out my secret was I started hunting this area. We were in Oregon and we had just figured this out, right? And it was like, man, when we look into this timber patch, we see elk. And so I went back to that spot as I was looking at, a couple years ago, we threw a dart at the map, picked a spot in Idaho, and I went back to our spot in Oregon and I looked at the timber density and I looked at the pitch. I looked at everything. I was like, I want to try to find that. If you're a new hunter and you have some kind of mentor of any kind, and be like, hey, show me what it looks like when you found elk. And I did this in Colorado. My good buddy Jaden, he was down there, and I was like, "Hey, show me a pen where you've seen deer. I don't care. Like, I'm not gonna hunt it. Like, I just want to know what. Like, tell me what I need to see." And because it looks different, right? And you can look at a map, and it can be very difficult. You do this long enough, and I can pick stuff out pretty well. But what I can do is I can play samesies. It's the similar game, right? And I could just take a spot in Montana and I go, okay, now I go to Arizona. What's that look like? Actually, an actual thing I did. I have a buddy who's hunted Arizona, and I said, hey, send me a pin of like some elky area, like where you found elk and what it looks like. And I don't care about the spot, the drainage the area, the unit. I don't care at all. What I do care about is like, what did that habitat look like? Now, how do I find that in the unit I'm hunting? And that's super, super good tip. Like if you can do that, you take someone and say, hey, show me a super elky area. I'll never go there. You have to trust me on this, but I need to see what it looks like on the map, because sometimes it looks very different. And most of the time it looks very different when you're looking at, a 3D map versus what it looks like in real life.
Yeah, that's great advice. Sometimes that can just, it's like that light bulb goes off in your head and you're like, oh, I was looking at this all wrong. Or, maybe sometimes you're like, hey, I was on the right track and, I just got
Totally.
to keep at it or something.
Totally. And that can be even within a unit. Say I go to 27 and I'm like, man, we saw elk all over in this part of the unit. Now I just take that same thing and I'm looking for the same type of feature. So if I was like, oh man, like this hillside had a bunch of elk on it, there's a lot of reasons those elk could have been there. The least of which could be just the type of food that's growing, right? You think about bears, like bears are they focus in on these food groups, right? And so like they'll be there. And so if you can kind of find a similar steepness, a similar aspect, a similar timber pattern, and you're like, that's the thing, right? And now I just got to find it again on the map.
Hmm. Well, awesome. I think we're a bit over an hour here, so I
Okay.
think we could go all night, I'm sure, and probably
Yeah.
into the morning. I want to thank you again for coming on here. This was fantastic. I will give another plug for the e-scouting course on the onX YouTube channel. We'll include a link for everybody on here, not only to this recording, but also to that YouTube playlist in the email you'll get tomorrow from us in the evening, so that you can check that out if you can't find it on the YouTube channel before then. And yeah, I guess to close it out, I want to thank you again and hope everybody has luck on their elk hunts this year. And we'll catch you on the next one.
Thanks, guys.